Nein, hast du? Oh nein. Wollte jetzt kein konkretes Kummerangebot. Also, das Telefon also, ja. Im Bereich des Möglichen, das ist total. Es ist wirklich eine schöne ich auch nicht mehr sehen, dass das letzte Mal
Okay, then for 25 minutes of prospect theory, because I actually have to leave at 1:45 because there's something else at 4. Good. So we are still talking about the basic economic theories of choice that have been proposed over centuries, and we now or we reach expected utility theory, which was kind of the mid-20th century, and then today we are going to talk about prospect theory, or at least start with talking about prospect theory, which is kind of the theory about how people perform economic decisions or decisions under uncertainty where there are maybe some beneficial, like monetary outcomes, and that was proposed in the 1970s, and which still, in a way, it's still the working hypothesis. It's definitely still very prominent in microeconomics, in behavioral economics, and in the psychology and neuroscience of decision making. And it's also very famous, so it will bring up another name that I guess you know. So Daniel Kahneman is one of the people who worked on prospect theory, and together with Alan Tversky they got the Nobel Prize for that. I don't think that Zimbardo got the Nobel Prize for. Thanks. Good. So to get started again, prospects. So it's called prospect theory. So let's first think again what prospects are. Prospects essentially are these kind of lotteries where you can choose between this kind of thing where you get $100 with a zero. My laser pointer. Where you get $100 with 0.5 probability or 0 with 0.95. You can either choose this or this, where you get $5 per sure and nothing with 0 probability. And we discussed a little bit that you can, when we talked about lotteries last time, the lotteries were actually defined as these probability tuples over fixed outcomes. Sometimes these things are called, this whole thing is called a gamble and so on. So one needs to be a little bit, if one talks with people about these kind of choices between these lotteries, probability distributions, or however you want to call them, one should try to make sure that when you communicate about these things that both you and the person you're talking to mean the same thing, because it's sometimes not that clear. So here this would be one choice option, and this is the other choice option. Now, we already also talked about risk in this context before. So here, risk neutral behavior in these kind of lottery choices, as I call them now here, is an indifference between a lottery and its expected value. So what is meant by this is the following. So the expected value, as we discussed, of something like this is 0.05 times 100 plus 0.95 times 0. So this the expected value of this is $5. And this is also $5. So this is you can always view this certain lottery as kind of just in this scenario, of course, the expected value of this. And if you're now indifferent between getting the expected value, so getting $5, or playing this lottery, then you would be called risk neutral. Yeah. So if I offer you $5 for sure, or a 5% probability to win 100, and you say, I don't care, then this would be called risk neutral. If you prefer the sure payment over the risky lottery with the same expected value or maybe even a larger expected value, so you could think that here you might have a, let's say 10 or let's say 6% probability or 0.06 probability of getting 100 versus getting 5 for sure. If you then still would take 5, this would have a higher expected value. So if you prefer the sure payment over such a lottery or an even higher expected value, this would be called risk averse. Yeah. So if you in this concrete case, like it's written here, prefer the $5 for sure, then this would be called risk averse. And if you prefer the risky lottery, where you have a 5% chance of getting the 100 over the sure outcome with the same expected value, or even a higher expected value. So, for example, if I offer you, you can either have 10 for sure or a 5% probability of getting 100, and you choose this option, then you would be called risk seeking. Yeah. This is kind of the nomenclature on risk neutrality, risk aversiveness, and risk seeking behavior that you can observe in these lottery choices. Of course, it's not the same as kind of the personality trait of being risk averse or risk seeking or anything. And as I also mentioned before, there is some current research also here from the Max Planck Institute where they correlate a person's choice behavior on these kind of lottery choices with some more real-life risk attitudes, like having insurance for certain things, having a retirement plan, engaging in fun sports or whatever you call things like bungee jumping, or we would have called bungee jumping like in the 90s. I think today it's wingsuit flying, what people do instead of bungee jumping. These things, and what they find is that these things are not necessarily correlated. Yeah. So don't. One should not over generalize these findings on what people do here to other kind of real world behavior. Having said that, we will actually link them with real world behavior a bit. So this is the starting point also of Kahneman and Tversky, and they also start from expected utility theory. And what we've learned there, that one idea would be that people form, instead of forming the expected values, they form the expected utilities and choose based on them. And now in their famous paper from the early 70s, I should know, I think it's 72 or so, they say, okay, it's a little bit more complex, and depending, and it depends on also whether we are talking about the gain domain or the loss domain, and isn't there, so the paper works a little bit like in a suggestive manner, without presenting necessarily too much empirical evidence for these kind of choice behavior, but saying like, isn't it kind of obvious that people do these kind, or that there are these risk attitudes, which they then go on to explain by prospect theory. So, and these risk attitudes, which I just mentioned, are referred to as the fourfold pattern of risk attitudes. Basically, this whole thing is about gain domain versus loss domain. So you can gain something versus you lose the same something, and high versus low probabilities. So I think some of you encountered this before, or at least you mentioned the other day, I don't remember your name, Luis, sorry, that you had something with the loss and the gain domain. Wasn't it you? loss and gain domain, so that people behave differently whether they talk about losses, monetary losses, or monetary gains.
Yeah.
You said something like that.
Yeah, but I think my connection was with adrenaline and with the feeling of risk. Well, that's the same thing. But I mean the feeling of risk connected not to the gain per se, but to the adrenaline.
Okay, that wouldn't be about gains and losses. Here it's about gains and losses, and let me talk you through this. So this is, if you read the paper, essentially Kahneman and Tversky present this fourfold pattern of risk attitudes and like some empirical fact, and there's definitely something to it, but it's just presented, and then it's going to be explained. So let me first now explain what this fourfold pattern of risk attitude is. So what they say is that in general humans are risk-seeking when it's about gains and low probabilities, and so they claim that most people, and there's also, of course, you can also find empirical evidence for that, that most people in such a scenario where you can either choose, you can choose to get either $5 for sure, or you have a 5% chance of getting 100. So you have a small probability, but you have you are in the gain domain and you have a high gain to get. People would choose A here, and the explanation or not say the explanation, but the real world example would be something like gambling. Yeah. So if there's a small chance of getting quite a lot, people feel attracted to that and would also prefer in this scenario losing this $5, which they could have had. But here they, of course, they have a high chance of not getting anything. So you can also think about that they need to pay €5 here to have this 5% chance of getting 100. Yeah. So that's in a way the idea is that humans in this kind of scenario like to gamble if it's about gain. So why do people play the lottery after all? So they have to pay something, but they, although there's a small probability, they play it. How this is explained then mathematically, we don't discuss yet, but we'll get to it. And the first then important thing is the difference if the whole thing is framed in the loss domain. Yeah. So here nothing has changed except the sign in front of the $100 and the $5. So here Kahneman and Tversky argue that if it's about big losses, so you have a 5% chance of having a loss of minus 100, or you have to pay $5 for sure. So you have a loss and you have a low probability for that loss here, then people would rather act risk averse. And the example for this, the real world example for this is insurance. So with an insurance, I think that's the word. With an insurance, you try to. So in an insurance, you have to pay something for sure. You pay your health insurance and so on, but you avoid a high loss, which only occurs with a low probability. Yeah, you're not prone to gambling when it comes about big losses. That's kind of the idea. So basically, if you're asked, do you want to play the lottery to win something, you would say yes. But if you would say, do you want to play the lottery with respect to your health, so in terms of loss, you would rather say, or maybe health is a little bit too strong because it has many other risk associations, but maybe in terms of your car insurance, where let's say it's not about that you, or even simpler Haftpflichtversicherung, I don't know the word, so where you basically, it's not about you actually having some real harm to yourself, but it's about you might have a real high financial loss if by you cause some damage to someone else. You remain unharmed, but you really don't want to encounter this high financial loss. So rather you pay a little bit every month for your Haftpflichtversicherung. Does anyone know the Haftpflichtversicherung term in English? But I think it's a better example than health insurance, actually, because it's about money.
Material insurance? I don't think it's the right one, but like material insurance or something.
Liability.
Liability.
Liability insurance.
What's that?
Haftpflicht, yeah. Haftpflicht. It's the Haftpflichtversicherung. Okay. Good. So I hope you see this a little bit, and in a way, of course. So if you like this kind of without showing much empirical evidence for that, it's an intuitive argument, and you would say, okay, if there's a low probability for gains, then people would go for it, so risk seeking. Whereas if there's a low probability for losses, they would rather try to avoid it. That's two so far. There are more. And let's see whether I get those right. So now, if it's about gains, but now with high probabilities. So if you have a high probability here for a gain, and here you also have a high probability for a gain, so we are in the gain domain. Then they argue that rather than having a 95% chance of winning 100 and a 5% chance of getting nothing, people would prefer getting the 95 for sure. And the argument here is that, of course, the argument would be that you try to avoid regret. So you basically the idea is that you basically gain kind of the same thing, but here you can have the problem that you are in this group, or that you get a zero, then you really lost out. So this avoiding regret can make people risk averse for gains and high probabilities. Do you have a real example? Because I can't think of one where you try to, where you are happy with receiving a little bit less rather than the complete jackpot, although there was only a small probability that you would have lost it, but you really want to make sure that you get that. I can't think of a good example. I understand. Russian roulette, does that work? I mean, that's definitely the whole thing is
investment options. There's like these different risk rates, and there's the completely sure ones where you don't really gain anything because the zinsen are too low right now. And then there's the ones where you get a little bit more because the zinsen are still very low, but you still have the risk that it all goes down to zero.
Yeah, but you must be sure that, of course, you get roughly the same out of both, right?
Yes, and I'm quite sure there's this option because you don't get that much more even with risky options, except if you go for like the really high risk ones.
That might be. One has to be yeah. Okay, let's think that this is a good example. With the Russian roulette, I'm not quite sure. So the Russian roulette, there you have, of course, a mixture, right? So it's sometimes not that easy to think about these things. But so I would say in the Russian roulette, you can win a lot, but you can also lose a lot. So you have, but I'm not quite sure whether it maps onto that. I would have to think it through. Don't see it immediately because I don't see that you have this thing that you that you have 5% chance of being dead, and you prefer. I wouldn't. I'm not quite sure how it works. Maybe think about it and tell us next
I
time.
think the difficult part is because there is nothing to win actually. Besides, like,
In Russian roulette?
yeah, so you have the status quo. So you're going into the game alive, and then you're going out and you're still alive.
No, but I think usually they play it with like
Monetary gain.
monetary gain, yeah. So that you have a monetary gain, that you get $1 million.
Really?
Everybody puts in $100, and the one that survives gets all of it.
Oh.
At least that's how that's how I play it.
I always want for the hypothetical scenario that you kidnap someone and then you're like, okay, so now let's talk, and you're putting one wallet in, it's like, okay, and then you might be lucky.
Yeah, but usually okay, Russian roulette, maybe that's our homework. Think about how Russian roulette fits into this. The other one here, I also don't have a really good real world example, but I can understand at least the effective motivation. So you are, it's in the loss domain, and you have a high, so here you for sure will lose $95. And here there's a 95% chance that you lose $100. And here the idea would be that people are risk-seeking in this situation because it offers at least the hope that or there's some beneficial chance that nothing will go wrong, and that you actually save your money and get $0. So personally, I think I also looked for real world examples for those, and I had a harder time finding those. So risk seeking for gains and low probabilities versus risk aversion for losses and low probabilities. You see real world examples for that. These things I understand from an effective perspective, and actually being confronted with these choices. I don't have that good like insurance or lotteries, very good real life examples, because I also didn't find them. But you said investments. I think this also comes up. Any suggestions for this, where it's only about loss, and you might be able to avoid loss by going this way rather than going into a sure loss?
I once went to a restaurant where we could opt to buy basically lottery ticket as well. And then we had a chance of not paying anything at all if we bought the lottery ticket, but if we didn't buy it, we were sure to pay.
No.
Yeah.
No. I don't know why they do that, but it's nice for the customers. Okay, that's.
I can imagine for the first example, but it's really very abstract. Love would be a perfect example because, for example, you know a person and it's great, but that person has one big defect, so you can take it, or you can keep searching for something better. But it's like the same with human relationships in general.
In what
like you can take what is already there and you know more or less the probabilities, or you can keep searching.
So, and you mean that for this, or for what do you mean?
No, for under.
For which one? This
Left.
one?
Left.
This one? Which one? This one? Which one?
The left one. The left and down under.
Unten links.
This one?
Yeah.
You mean like instead of for princess, you take the.
Yeah, but I would be careful there. So wait! Don't stop discussing that, because this is what you are referring there is the secretary problem. The thing is here.
Secretary problem.
the secretary problem. That's called the secretary problem. It's quite sexist, I agree. But there's the or no, it's not. I'm being sexist because if I think of a secretary, I think of a woman. But my secretary, my personal secretary here is actually a man. Anyway, so so the problem is this is called secretary problem, and there it's about learning about other things. And here, this is a decision under risk where the probabilities are all well known. So when you're referring there to accepting what you currently see versus exploring more, that's actually a different kind of problem. That's decisions, what you would call them under decisions under not decisions under risk, but decisions under uncertainty, and it's a sampling problem, so it's different from this scenario.
Okay, because there's uncertainty, and in this case, there are like certainty, like there are
fixed probabilities. So there it's but this goes back to this nomenclature of Knight that we discussed previously. So this is something different. It's a different framework. Yeah. So this applies only the sole expected utility and prospect theory if the probabilities of everything are known and also the outcomes. Okay. So so basically we stop here then. So prospect theory now, what it does is that it aims for explaining the fourfold pattern of risk attitudes by interactions of nonlinear outcome and probability weighting functions. So the important thing is that in contrast to expected utility theory, it looks at low probabilities and high probabilities in a nonlinear way, and also looks at the loss and the gain domains differently. And how that looks in detail we then discuss next time. And I'm done for today. Questions? No? Good.